Howdy, today on Flippin Science, we're looking at nitrogen. So you need to be able to write equations for the formation of nitrogen oxides from the reaction between nitrogen and oxygen. You need to be able to describe the nitrogen cycle's natural and industrial processes, and also explain why fertilizers need to be in a soluble form. So nitrogen in the atmosphere, it's two nitrogen atoms stuck together with a strong covalent triple bond. It's not particularly reactive because of that triple bond. You have to break that triple bond to get the nitrogen to react with anything. The amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere is around about 80%, and that's fairly constant. Because it's constant, that tells us there's a cycle that's producing nitrogen and a cycle that's getting rid of nitrogen, and they work together in the nitrogen cycle. So here's a bit of a picture of the nitrogen cycle. You have atmospheric nitrogen. It gets fixed through lightning or bacterial processes. It gets incorporated into organisms, and then when organisms get broken down, it gets released back into the atmosphere. So when we're talking about natural nitrogen fixation, we're talking about taking the nitrogen from the atmosphere and turning it into something else. So some bacteria, which are found in nodules in legumes, so these are nodules, inside there is the bacteria, they can take nitrogen gas and turn it into ammonia or ammonium ions. They contain an enzyme that does that. There's also high energy processes that can do this. So lightning and forest fires and volcanoes, they can provide enough energy to break that triple bond between the nitrogen atoms. Nitrogen then reacts with oxygen to produce nitric oxide, and then that nitric oxide further reacts in the atmosphere to produce nitrogen dioxide. Nitrogen dioxide dissolves in water in the atmosphere to make nitric acid, and then that can be deposited and it ionizes in solution to make nitrate ions, which can be absorbed by plants. We can also artificially fix nitrogen using a process like the Haber process over here. So in the Haber process, you take nitrogen from the atmosphere, you react it with hydrogen, and that passes over a catalyst bed, and that produces ammonia. And then that ammonia can be converted into other compounds that can be used as fertilizers. Also, before we talked about lightning and volcanoes, that same reaction happens inside internal combustion engines inside cars. So there's enough heat energy to break the triple bond between the nitrogen. Nitrogen reacts with oxygen to produce nitric oxide, and then that can go on to further produce nitrogen dioxide. Before plants can use the nitrogen, it needs to be converted into something that they can use. Ammonia can be a little bit too toxic for plants, so it's often converted by bacteria into nitrite and then nitrate ions, and then these are soluble and easily absorbed by plants. So plants have to absorb nutrients in a soluble form, or otherwise they can't use it. They don't have a digestive system like we do. So before we saw the Haber process, converting nitrogen into ammonia in industrial quantities, you can apply that ammonia directly onto plants, but like I said, sometimes it's a little bit too strong. So it can be converted into other compounds that can be used as a fertilizer. So ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, ammonium phosphate, and so on. The advantage of some of these is that you get nitrate as well, so ammonium and nitrate, so you can have both compounds containing nitrogen being absorbed. Same with ammonium phosphate, so if your soil is poor in phosphorus as well as nitrogen, you can place that on. And yeah, so here's some examples of those fertilizers. So like I said, nitrogen is a good fertilizer. The reason for that is that the nitrogen is required for root development and leaf growth. It's very important in terms of making nucleic acids, proteins, and chlorophyll. There's a lot of nitrogen in those compounds. Phosphorus is another fertilizer that's often incorporated in at the same time. It's about leaf growth and plant size as well. Phosphorus is found in nucleic acids, ATP and ADP. So when you have soil with low amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, you use a fertilizer. And like I said before, they need to be in an aqueous form so the plants can absorb it. If it's not in an aqueous form, then the plants don't have the ability to absorb it in any way. They don't have mouths, they don't have digestive systems. They just absorb the nutrients in their soluble form in their roots, and then from there they're incorporated into plant structures. So like I just said, the nitrogen is usually absorbed by plants as nitrate ions. So you take your ammonia or your ammonium or urea, they get broken down by bacteria in the soil to nitrates, and then the nitrate is absorbed by the plant. So here's some examples of those nitrogen-containing fertilizers. So now we'll look at some exam questions. So it says the roots of kudzu plants contain bacteria that use a reactant in air to produce ammonia. Identify the reactant in air that bacteria use to produce ammonia. That's fairly easy. That's nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, N2. Any of those would be acceptable. So here's another example question. It says, describe the process by which nitrogen dioxide in the atmosphere can contribute to an increase in the level of nitrogen in the soil. So we talked about this briefly. The nitrogen dioxide will react with water to make nitric acid. That nitric acid will ionize in rainwater to produce hydrogen ions and nitrate ions. Then as that rain falls, you'll get the nitrate ions going into the soil, and that will increase the amount of nitrogen in the soil. So today on Flipping Science, we looked at nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle. That's it for Flipping Science today. See ya.